thanks for joining us. And now it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Gwenaëlle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and welcome to all of you. And thank you for your interest for this topic, which is highly debated these days and put us all in a situation of complete schizophrenia, with on the one hand the fact that we are celebrating the conclusion of the Global Compact on Migration, and as the ICRC we were extremely pleased to see that one of the objectives we were pushing, which is Objective 8, to save life and prevent the people from going missing and address the plight of missing migrants and their families. And we have seen states taking hand on heart the several very important commitments. Allow me to remind some of them. So firstly, a commitment to cooperate internationally to put in place effective mechanism to rescue people at sea. Second important commitment, and which is to ensure that assistance of a purely humanitarian nature is not considered unlawful. Thirdly, to review the impact of their migration policies in order to ensure that the latter do not create further risk for people going missing or being exposed to harm. And in the midst of this climate of celebration, in reality, on the ground, we see a completely different situation. And we witness, I must say, with consternation in the humanitarian world, what is happening today in the Mediterranean, with a collective failure of states to put in place a functioning system of cooperation to save lives of people and to agree on a way for providing responsibility sharing on the reception of survivors. And basically tolerating that the Mediterranean Sea is becoming a collective gravesite. So just before giving the floor and introducing the panelists, I just would like to remind a few figures to set the scene. One important figure coming from UNHCR is the fact that we are in a situation of absolute decrease of migrants, including refugees, reaching the shore of Europe. So basically, we have figures which are today five times lower than what they were at the peak of what we would call not at all a migration crisis, but a migration management crisis, reaching the shore of Europe. And at the very same time, paradoxically, we see the death rate increasing or skyrocketing in the Mediterranean. According again to the UNHCR, when today, for instance, in the month of June 2018 alone, 1 out of 7 persons trying to cross the Mediterranean on the central Mediterranean road, that means basically from Libya essentially, 1 out of 7 will die or go missing. When we put this figure in perspective, it was 1 in 19 in the beginning of this year and 1 in 38. So basically, migrants are playing roulette russe or when they cross the Mediterranean. Other important figures also to mention is in the absence of an effective intergovernmental coordination mechanism to search and rescue people, NGOs such as SOS Mediterranean were accountable or should be given the credit for rescuing 40% of the people who were disembarked in Italy, so were a really absolute essential component of this system and this mechanism to save lives. Last figures, this time from the ICRC, we should not forget that many of the people dying are children. Not that the life of women and men have no values, but we should not forget this in the mounting security-centered narrative. For instance, in Greece, on the 312 precise cases on which we are working in connection with shipwreck at sea, 40% of them concern children. So that's just to set a bit the scene and open these debates, which is not really very positive, I would say, or considering the present situation. So let me introduce the panelists. So Caroline Aboussada, who is the director of SOS Méditerranée Suisse, and was formerly the director of the research unit of MSF, Switzerland, again. Dorothée Los-Simzienska, who is a lawyer and works as the head of the legal department of the International Maritime Organization, and will explain also what is the role of this organization, notably in relation to search and rescue operations. And lastly, Cameron Shilton, who works for the UNHCR, is protection officer for the UNHCR, and is notably working on question links to mixed flows and issue associated to the search and rescue operation and people in distress at sea. I will maybe start to give the floor to Dorota. Knowing that I mentioned before the Global Compact on Migration, which most of you know might know, is not a binding instrument, and also what is important to remind that the fact of rendering assistance to provide assistance to people at sea, in distress at sea, is not only a commitment that is taken hand on heart, but it is a legal obligation. Can you explain us a bit what is the law of the sea telling on this topic, after maybe explaining a bit what is the International Maritime Organization, because it's probably an institution that not everybody in the room knows.
Let me start first with introducing you to the International Maritime Organization. The organization was established in 1948, so we celebrate our 70th anniversary this year. It is United Nations specialized agency responsible for setting standards for the shipping industry. So the IMO regulates everything which is related to the construction, design, equipment of ships, mainly merchant vessels. Also, we regulate the protection of environment from the pollutions which emanate from ships. We regulate as well the civil liability for all kinds of pollution at sea. IMO has currently 174 member states. We have also numerous NGOs and IGOs as observers. Over the 70 years of existence, IMO developed more than 50 treaties. Most of them, only 3 of them are not in force, so most of them are binding, and they are very, very effective. Many of our treaties have a global impact, and most of IMO member states are also parties to our treaties. The Search and Rescue Convention, to which I will come in a second, is one of those 50 treaties developed and adopted under the IMO auspices. And we are based in London. We are the only UN organization which is located in London, not here. So please do not confuse the IMO with IOM, which is completely different organization. To the topic, the obligation of saving life at sea is, first of all, a moral obligation. So before all the treaties started being developed and before they entered into force, of course, there was an underlying moral obligation to save life at sea. The first convention, which was developed on the safety of life at sea, was the SOLAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea Convention, and it was adopted after the famous Titanic disaster. And all the following conventions are inherited from the first SOLAS Convention. Now, the obligation to save life at sea is, of course, also reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, where there is an obligation imposed on the parties to this treaty to ensure that every state will require from ships that the master has an obligation to rescue life at sea. The UNCLOS is not an IMO convention. It was developed under the UN itself, and the Secretariat in New York is responsible for this convention. The other conventions which relate to the search and rescue at sea are IMO convention, and as I said already, there is the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, which has the obligation of a master to render assistance and to save life at sea. Then we have the Search and Rescue Convention, which provides a legal framework of how to coordinate search and rescue operations, how states which are parties to this convention should cooperate in establishing search and rescue coordination centers, what facilities they should have in place, what obligations they have as search and rescue centers. Then there is the Facilitation of Maritime Traffic Convention, which provides for some administrative obligations which state parties to this convention have to fulfill, including the obligation to ensure that there are facilities in ports of respective state parties to absorb, to receive persons rescued at sea. And there is also Salvage Convention, which again imposes an obligation to save life at sea, and the persons who are saved do not have to pay for it. So this is the basic principle of that convention. IMO also developed numerous recommendations and guidelines to help our member states to provide assistance and to fulfill obligations under the international treaties. You have to bear in mind that all those treaties were developed with the set of mind that they apply to merchant ships, to ships which transport, which deliver goods to everybody. They were developed not to address the specific situation of migrants, but rather to address exceptional circumstances at sea when one ship is distressed and another merchant vessel passing by is in a position to render assistance to this ship in distress and persons on board of that ship. However, since the various crises around the globe took place, the crisis with migrants, not only in the Mediterranean, all over the world, this legal framework was reviewed several times by IMO and by other bodies, and it was decided that those obligations apply also to this particular situation, and that there is no need to adopt a new treaty or to revise existing treaties. Further assistance and further cooperation is needed, maybe developing new recommendations and guidelines, but it was decided that the legal framework applies also to those specific situations that we have now and we had also a couple of years ago. I will stop with this.
I would have maybe a question more connected to the current situation in the Mediterranean. There have been a lot of debates, heated debates, about the establishment of a very wide SAR zone for Libya and the creation of a coordinating center, maritime coordinating center by Libya. Could you explain us what is the role of the IMO, if any, in validating the size of a SAR zone, the capacity of an authority to coordinate search and rescue operations?
Yes, of course. The SAR Convention provides for an obligation to establish search and rescue zones. So each and every party to this convention should do so, ideally in cooperation with neighboring states, with the states from the region. And it is up to each state party to decide about its own area of search and rescue. They usually they don't have to comply with the jurisdictional areas. They don't have to be identical, but more often than not, they are identical. Now, the way it works is that when a search and rescue region is established, that was also the case with Libya, the organization is informed. So there is an obligation in the convention to inform the organization about the established search and rescue area. And of course, by that also it is understood that if this area is established, there are facilities, there is equipment, there are life-saving appliances in place, there is a good communication in place. There are several requirements which needs to be fulfilled in order to have effective search and rescue area in place. This information is provided to the organization, to the Secretary General, and we have the platform which is called Global Integrated Ship Information System, GISIS, which is available on our website. Everybody can access this system and can see which regions have been established, and this information has been provided to the organization. Now, the organization doesn't have a mechanism of verification whether the facilities are in place, whether the search and rescue zone is effective, and how it works. But of course, each and every state party and member state of the organization can bring any concern to the attention of the organization, to the Maritime Safety Committee or any other committee which would which would have mandate to look at it. I think it was last year that the organization was informed about the establishment of this Libyan search and rescue zone, and also at the same time the Maritime Safety Committee was informed by Italy, and the document is available again on our website, about the project which is run by the European Union and by Italy to help Libya to establish this zone and to put in place all the facilities and all other measures that are required to have an effective search and rescue coordination center and effective search and rescue services in the area. So the organization received this information, and I understand that this is an ongoing process which started this year and will last for 1 year, and we will be again informed what measures have been put in place in this particular region.
Yeah. Another question is really the question of disembarkation and whether the law of the sea creates any obligation for a state to open its port for docking, and whether there's a definition of what is a safe port of disembarkation and a mechanism to assess it.
So each and every convention would have its own definitions, and of course there are definitions for what is a safe port and what is the distress, and the SAR convention actually defines what is the situation of distress, and also provides for an obligation that each party should authorize its rescue and coordination centers to make necessary arrangements for disembarking persons found in distress at sea. So yes, there is this obligation imposed on the state parties of the SAR Convention that they should identify those places which are assigned as disembarkation places.
But is there an obligation for the states to open their port, or a system to coordinate which state should allow disembarkation?
Well, if you read the SAR Convention, yes, there is this obligation that they should coordinate and cooperate and should designate places of disembarkation. And this is the whole point of the SAR Convention, that the states from each and every region should cooperate and designate those places.
Have you seen, in a specific context of migrants in distress at sea, a context where you see that the system is functioning, be it today or in the past, where this system was properly functioning and could serve as an inspiration?
There are several regions in the world where the system is functioning well. I don't think that there is an example of any region in the world when you have massive phenomenon and the response is maybe not adequate, but generally the search and rescue zones do operate, do function very well. For example, you have the Baltic Sea search and rescue area where states cooperate very well. Of course, you don't have then the migrants in this region.
I would have to point it.
Of course, it depends from which perspective you look. If you look only from the perspective of the SAR Convention and how it works and whether there are model regions in the world, of course there are. But if you face a situation which is unusual, then of course every region in the world would face some difficulties with a massive unusual phenomenon.
We have heard a bit the point of view of the law on the sea. It would be interesting from the UNHCR, Cameron, if you agree, to explain us a bit how these questions they interplay with international refugee law and the protections of refugees.
So I'm from UNHCR, and I'm going to jump right in and assume that most people here know who and what that is, the UN Refugee Agency, also with the mandate and respect of statelessness and in some circumstances internally displaced people. To the question, I think interplay is the right word. Of course, when you're thinking about search and rescue and responses to people at sea, the first place you go is the IMO conventions and UNCLOS, but refugee law has some very clear things to say as well. And the most important central point there is the way the core principle in refugee law of non-refoulement applies to search and rescue situations and other situations at sea. And it does apply to those situations. Non-refoulement, of course, is broadly speaking the idea that you can't send a refugee back in its canonical formulation in the Refugee Convention to a place where there's going to be some threat to their life or freedom on the basis of one of the convention grounds, and related prohibitions in human rights law against return to a place where you face serious human rights violations, torture, ill treatment, those sort of things. And the key point with non-refoulement is that it doesn't only apply to state action within and from its own territory, it also applies wherever a state acts in a way that places someone at risk, where they've exercised jurisdiction or some sort of effective control over a person, even outside their territory. And that includes within territorial waters or even on the high seas. And it doesn't really matter whether an operation at sea, for example, in the case of migrants or refugees crossing the Mediterranean or somewhere else, is characterised as a search and rescue operation or as an interception operation or something else. That core obligation not to return people to somewhere where their lives or freedoms are going to be in peril applies to any sort of state intervention in that regard.
On this, could you maybe clarify, and then this question is for both Cameron and for Caroline, at the more operational level, is there's a lot of confusion between search and rescue operation, typically Mare Nostrum, said by the Italian government, and an interception operation, typically Frontex or UNAVFOR, which is currently at sea. What is the difference and what is the impact on the principle of renouement, according to you, and on operational level?
I'll give the sort of boring black letter answer and then you can give the lively answer. I guess for UNHCR it is important to maintain that distinction wherever we can. Search and rescue is fundamentally a humanitarian response, and it's an obligation under international law to come to the assistance of people who are in distress at sea. Interception is less of a term of art, but generally we understand it to be operations that are intended more at some sort of law enforcement or migration management response. And the distinction is important in the first instance because different areas of international law regulate what's supposed to happen in those contexts. And in the case of search and rescue, there are clear implications for the place of disembarkation, which we were just talking about a second before. To go back to what I was saying before, there are clear issues that arise in the distinction between a search and rescue operation and an interception operation of whatever kind. But as I was saying before, non-refoulement is going to apply in both circumstances, and that's the key factor. An interception operation, if what you understand by that is some intervention at sea or at a border or somewhere else, which is aimed at enforcing domestic law, domestic migration law, or stopping people from moving to a particular place. That's something that states are perfectly entitled to do in particular circumstances, which we can go into a little bit more perhaps, and that's going to depend on where it happens and how it happens. And the core thing is that human rights are respected whenever that takes place, and that, going back to my key point, which was the non-refoulement point, let me leave it there, and you can tag onto that, and then I can come back if you like.
But just to give a bit of perspective, because there's two cases in which we spoke about the differences between search and rescue operations and interceptions. The first one was indeed during the Mare Nostrum operation. So just to give a bit of background, I usually do a previously on search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, so you're all aware of how it went. October 2013, you have this massive shipwreck with at least 300,000, I'm getting excited. 300 people died on the shore, or almost on the shore of Lampedusa, and that triggered this institutional official response from Italy, and they started this Mare Nostrum operation with the specific goal of saving lives. And that was clearly stated, which they actually did, and did very well, because they saved between 100 and 150,000 people in this year. This was stopped in 2014 under the pressure of the European Union, and one of the arguments used was you're actually creating a pull factor, and this has to stop. So Italy stopped, also because it was an extremely expensive operation, and the European Union decided to start this UNAVFOR Med Sofia operation with the specific goal of intercepting smugglers. And I actually have an official email from the operation, from one of the captain of the operation, saying our goal is not to save lives. So that was clear, which they didn't do. And so that's 2014, and in response to that, in 2015, you have a bunch of NGOs which started search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. And that's where you have basically the big numbers, or at least the most important numbers of people trying to cross the Mediterranean. And 2016, I'm sorry, I'm doing the fast forward. 2016, the numbers are reducing a little bit. NGOs are still present. And 2017 starts the crackdown on NGOs, especially from Italy, with this, you might have heard of this code of conduct, which was imposed on NGOs. Some of them decided to sign, some decided not to sign, and stopped operation. And the last bunch decided to sign an amended version of the code of conduct, which SOS Méditerranée actually did. The two red lines we had on the code of conduct was the presence of armed policemen on board, and the second was they were trying to stop transshipment. So when you have smaller boats rescuing people, transboarding them on bigger boats to avoid doing back and forth in between the search and rescue area and ports. And that's when NGOs also started being criminalized, and you have the first boat stopped and officially arrested in the 2nd of August 2017, and that's the Juventa, which is still undergoing criminal charges, and it's even if things are getting much clearer now, they're still under arrest at the moment. And that's when the European Union decides deliberately to basically empower the Libyan Coast Guard. So I'm saying that in brackets because people think there's like a unified system of Libyan Coast Guard. It's not the case at the moment. There's a bunch of militias also involved in these operations. And that's, I would say, like the second phase of search and rescue versus interceptions. Because what we've noticed at sea is that most of the operations run by Libyan Coast Guard with the support of the European Union are definitely not to save lives. They are not equipped for that. They don't have life jackets. They don't have the training. And basically what they're doing is just stopping the boat. If some people die in the process, ma'alesh, and then they take whoever is still alive after the interception and they bring them back to Libya. So that's, I would say, like the second phase. So as a search and rescue organization, it's extremely difficult because we've been witnessing some of these cases. It's complicated because Libyan Coast Guard have been extremely violent in some instances. We had also the case, for example, 2 days ago, Sunday, where there was a rescue going on, and we had direct threats from the boat of the Libyan Coast Guard. So it's adding an additional layer on the difficulty of providing safety for people. Mm-hmm. And that's also, and if I might just finish on the death rate, We've seen, as you said, the death rate skyrocketing in the last month. One of the explanations for this increase of death is definitely the interventions of the Libyan Coast Guard.
My transition is going to be a bit abrupt after what you said, but sticking to this question of deadlock, basically in the Mediterranean Sea, we would be interested in having the point of view of the UNHCR on this situation and your perspective in this respect.
If I had all the answers for that, I would be very happy indeed. I guess
pass them on if you have.
Yeah, exactly. I guess, I mean, to be a little simple-minded about it, the question of why we have this deadlock comes back in part to the point that Dorothea was making, which was that the search and rescue system as we have it wasn't designed to deal with this kind of problem. We know that it does apply to this situation and that every person, and it's quite clear in the treaties, whether they're a commercial passenger, a seafarer, a migrant or a refugee who's in distress, needs to be rescued and brought to a safe place as quickly as possible. And that's very, very clear. But the deadlock comes from the practical inability to sever the link between rescue and disembarkation and responsibility for international protection, responsibility for other kinds of follow-up when people are rescued and disembarked in a way that respects international law and genuinely involves cooperation to share burdens and responsibilities. Which is the $5 million question. You're busting to jump in there.
Yeah.
It's a state-of-the-art UNHCR answer.
Oh.
Well done.
This is true, though. It's not easy to achieve, but...
On this, is there a region of the world, because I mean, we are going to speak today a lot about migrants in distress at sea, but we are fully aware that migrants are dying on other migratory roads at sea. We can think at the Andaman Sea a few years ago.
Yeah.
Is there
You want to do it for me?
Somewhere?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please go ahead.
There's like a huge absent from the picture. And I'm not going to talk about the Andaman Sea. I'm sticking to the central Mediterranean route. But there is today a deliberate system put in place by the European Union, and one of them is Italy, and we can discuss the Italian role to basically use, as you said, the management of border control as a way to handle migration first, and as a way also to criminalize people like or NGOs providing rescue at sea. I mean, it's not the responsibility of the European Union today in having decided that they would basically give the package to Libya as if Libya were in a state of being able to handle the situation. We have 30,000 stories because we've rescued 30,000 people on board the Aquarius. It's 30,000 stories of mistreatment, abuses, rapes, ill treatment, etc., etc. We know exactly where we're bringing people back when we're bringing them in Libya. We know. It's a known fact. There has been testimonies, videos from even CNN has realized last year that the situation in Libya was dire. So we know exactly where we're sending them, and we're still doing it on purpose. So giving the responsibility of the search and rescue with the Joint Rescue Coordination Center to Libya, where we're in this schizophrenic situation where they have the responsibility on the SAR zone and of the coordination center, and Libya cannot be considered as a place of safety for people. So we end up in a situation, and we had that in August, where like the good part of the Libyan Coast Guard told us in August, guys, call the other MRCC because you cannot bring them back to Libya, which we did. So and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're basically taking responsibility for a rescue, you also have to give a port of safety to the people rescuing the boat.
According to the SAR Convention, you have to designate a place of disembarkation. The SAR Convention doesn't have any notion of a place of safety or safe port. It provides for an obligation to designate place of disembarkation.
But then it has to be a place of safety. Like you cannot put people in a situation where they could be ill-treated or mistreated or whatever.
We're talking about the situation where you guys have rescued?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So I'll ask Dorota to come to my aid if I'm fudging something in terms of international maritime law here. But the SAR Convention and the SOLAS Convention, as I understand it, don't give you a definition of place of safety. The Maritime Safety Council's non-binding guidelines, which they issued in 2004 or something, do set out a definition. It's pretty limited. It says essentially, and I don't remember the terms, it's a place where someone's no longer in danger and so forth, where their immediate needs can be met.
So we all agreed that Libya doesn't qualify.
I'm coming to that. Quite right. No, don't. I'm giving the same guidelines say that where refugees or asylum seekers are rescued, then any risk to their lives and freedoms is also a consideration. So that's very clear in those guidelines as well. UNHCR's very clear position is that the situation in Libya, particularly for refugees and migrants, is not one which would allow for disembarkation in a safe place there.
So as I said, the Search and Rescue Convention provides for obligation to designate disembarkation. The FAL Facilitation Convention, which I mentioned earlier, and I also mentioned this obligation that public authorities shall facilitate the arrival and departure of ships engaged in the rescue of persons in distress at sea in order to provide a place of safety for such persons. So yes, as I said, in various treaties you will have either place of safety or a place of refuge or place of disembarkation, whatever you call it, but in the end it is up to state parties to those treaties to interpret these terms.
I must say, it's really a pleasure to receive NGO representatives. It makes the debate much more lively than when it's international organization, and I put the ICRC in it. And no blame on anyone.
We can raise hands in the room. So there's no debate today that people cannot be sent back to Libya. There's an excellent document that you can download that has been published by UNHCR in September 2018 that specifies exactly why Libya cannot be, I mean, I'm saying it with my NGO words, but it's where you cannot bring, why you cannot bring people back, people back to Libya, and it's a very good document. And because I checked all the conventions that you quoted, and you started with a very powerful phrase that it's a moral obligation. And then, so first, the moral obligation is not met by European states. And second, we are actually in a situation where we are respecting, SOS Méditerranée, as we are the last non-governmental ship present in the central Mediterranean route, respecting all the conventions, SOLAS, SAR, etc. And we end up with states which are actually not holding up to their responsibilities. And it's actually very interesting to see all the arguments that are used against SOS, for example, in the media. That we are a pull factor again. So this has been demonstrated 15,000 times, and you have reports, forensic architecture, forensic oceanography, and others have proven black on white that this is not the case. That whatever ships, NGO ships you have in the vicinity of Libya, people would, in any case, leave the shore because the situation in Libya is so terrible that they have to go. So there's no correlation between the presence of NGO ships and people departing Libya. Then you have this, but you're helping smugglers. No, we're actually saving people's lives at sea, where the Aquarius, and we've decided to go after the Valencia episode at the end of June. There's a website that is called onboard-aquarius.org to play the full transparency card. So you can follow exactly what we do, where we are, who we speak to, the response of the different MRCCs. So at least we're playing that, the card of transparency. Everyone has access to it. And we end up in a situation where we're still considered, basically, as the bad guys. And it's completely surreal because discussing with people, and especially now that we are being deflagged again, and at least Panama was transparent enough to say that they are deflagging the Aquarius because of political and economic pressure from Italy. So it's extremely clear. It's that they're not pretending like Gibraltar that it's a technical issue, because basically the Panamanian authorities checked all the technical requirements in Marseille when we were there last time, and literally because I actually saw the Aquarius leaving last Saturday the port of Marseille, and a week after suddenly so we are losing the flag again. Knowing that we can't lose, we are supposedly not, we cannot lose the flag when we're at sea. So the thing is that as soon as we dock somewhere, we're going to lose it. Can I make a little call for action, since you have like this hashtag ICRC cycle? We're definitely now, so we're launching this hashtag flag for Aquarius because we're looking for a flag. So we end up in this surreal situation where we need to find a flag.
Maybe two things, just on this argument and on this argument that search and rescue operations would have an impact on the number of arrival. Yeah, indeed, it's super established that it's absolutely not correlated. What is established is that the number or the level of SAR operation has an impact on saving life or not. So I think it's important to mention. And maybe to follow on what you were mentioning. So we understood that you have been removed your flag for the second time. So basically, once you dock, you're not allowed to sail, and you are currently running with MSF the last NGO boat on the Mediterranean. And second, we also understand that you are currently stranded at sea with 58 people you have rescued. So can you just explain where you are, where do you stand?
First, just to come back on this, we're going to be stuck. It's not only a question of, I didn't present SOS Méditerranée, but I guess you've heard about the organization. At least the Aquarius is now known. But it's the way we conceive the operations is really like a very simple rescuing life at sea principle. The second one is really to be able to basically pass the testimonies we're collecting on board the Aquarius. So there's really, for us, an idea of it's a citizen movement that is there, present in the central Mediterranean, to keep an eye on what's going on, and to also be able to spread the word on the situation in Libya, and at least give that to the people we rescued. Is that there's not much we can do after we've rescued them, but at least we can transmit the information we have on the detention centers in Libya and the rest. If you stop the Aquarius in Marseille in 4 days, this capacity and this civilian capacity of witnessing what's going on in the central Mediterranean, what's going on with the Libyan Coast Guard, what's going on in Libya, is lost. So it's also, it's also something that people have to take into account, that if we're not there, the first, people will not be rescued, because it's not the Libyan Coast Guard who are going to do that. And second, this testimony witness capacity is also lost. And for me, it's extremely important that people realize that collectively in Europe, people realize that it's basically criminalizing solidarity, NGOs doing search and rescue, because it's not only search and rescue, there's a more global trend on criminalizing civil organizations in Europe, that it also has an impact on this witness capacity. And for me, it's a question of what exactly, in which society do we want to live today, where we cannot witness what's going on because we're just criminalized and stopped wherever it is. So, and that's important. And now the second point on the 58 people, we're still looking for an arrangement, which is one of the issues we're having at the moment, is that there is no predictable system of disembarkations for people. So it looks a bit like a grocery shop. Every time we have people, we have to call different MRCCs. Some are answering, some are not even picking up the phone. Some are saying, yeah, thank you, but no thank you next time. And it takes days. People are already traumatized. On board, they have no idea of when we'll be able to disembark them, where they're terrified. The situation is completely surreal. So at the moment, we're looking for the best solution possible. We're also looking for the nearest place of safety, like if we can avoid a situation where we have to sail 4 days back and forth to bring people, that would be useful.
What would be for you a functioning mechanism?
And that's what we've been calling for since 2015. What we want is an institutionalized European system of search and rescue at sea. It's what we've been asking for, and we're not changing. We need a predictable system of disembarkation for people. We need to make sure that people are being provided with protection as soon as possible. And we're not basically asking for the moon. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is to see that 58 people on board an orange ship is basically shaking up Europe for days, and that's completely surreal. We are talking about 58 people. We're even more in the room.
Obviously, one issue for you is that you can't find states that would let you disembark, right? That was the issue more before you were even arrested. There's this whole concept of sanctuary cities that is explored. For example, by Berlin is talking about it. Bremen in Germany is also talking about it. Is that a concept that you've explored, or is it even an option that you...
I'm sorry, you have to...
The concept of sanctuary cities, where cities would voluntarily say we would actually welcome refugees, and obviously the problem would then be, cities are located in states, and if the state doesn't agree, I don't really see how it works. But the question would be whether there's that is an option that you have explored.
You gave the answer in your question. It has to be coordinated at the state level. If Italy says, no, you don't disembark people in our ports. And Palermo, because we had the case in June, Palermo says, no, we will, we can't. Because it's a bit of one of the issues we're having the last month is there's a lot of what I call now political Twitter. That you have an announcement made on Twitter, and that basically people think it's a fact, and then you end up with 15 journalists calling you like, really? You're like, really what? And then because we had, so people are going to disembark in Palermo, or there was Corsica, and then we had Naples, and it's nice in the sense that it's nice in terms of mobilizing people and seeing that we have the support of some cities or of people. To be very pragmatic, we can't disembark people if a state and the MRCC, like the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, does not allow us to disembark people. We just can't do it.
I would maybe add some figures, as you said, Gwenaël, and also about the collateral damage, because not only has the death rate really skyrocketed, but what has skyrocketed and been multiplied manifold is the number of detentions. So that as Libyan Coast Guards are rescuing people trying to leave Libya, now, there used to be about 5,300 persons in detention in Libya, and in recent months this has risen to 10,000. And as mentioned, the people are detained there in the most horrendous conditions, and we should be aware of this. I am aware when representatives from UN agencies speak as these UN agencies that it is the member states in the agencies that sort of make the rules and play by the rules of the game. But it seems to me that member states of the Maritime Organization are also state parties to many human rights conventions and treaties and to the Refugee Convention. And what we see, and I agree with you that this is very schizophrenic, is that what we see right now is a huge exercise in discrimination of persons who risk their lives at sea, because this is clearly when you see the origin of people coming and the response. And you ask, for example, of other parts of the world where there was some SAR operations, and very much like the representative from the IMO, unfortunately, I don't have that many good examples. And I agree that these conventions were not adopted specifically for migrant rescue, but we have a very, very sad example, which was the Tampa incident in the Pacific Ocean that gave rise to a response by Australia called the Pacific Solution 1 and 2, whereby Australia went and bought sort of small island nations in the Pacific Ocean to transform them in detention centers. And if you follow closely, and I'm saying this because there are lots of young people who are likely students, or it would be really interesting for you to compare what's happening in the Mediterranean with what happened in Australia, because many politicians in Europe now are trying to emulate what happened and trying to create platforms and hotspots. So sorry, this is not a very positive contribution, but this is to show that the incident is not only in high level of death at sea, it's people being sent back. And I really wish there had been someone from the European Union that we could have asked questions. And the latest incident, if I'm correct, what you mentioned, Caroline, about the latest rescue from Aquarius, it's even more tragic, because from what I read, it seems that the majority of those 50 people are actually Libyans this time, yeah. Okay? So basically, by not allowing Aquarius to dock somewhere, let alone the Panama issue, this is really a blunt violation of the Refugee Convention. So anyway, just to signal this. Thank you.
I have a comment and a question. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really understand law at sea, but I just want to reflect on what I'm hearing a little bit, because you, Cameron, you say that international law applies at sea and that you say Libya is not a safe place and that you can't return people. At the same time, you don't operate a boat. So I would just ask, why not?
We can train you, Cameron. Change, you know.
It's a fair question, I guess, and it's one that I would have to put to my superiors and betters, but it's not something simply that falls within the sorts of things that the UNHCR has expertise or capacity or mandate to do at the moment. Search and rescue, and I'll turn to Dorothée, not to avoid the question, but the search and rescue system puts obligations on shipmasters and so forth, and the NGOs have been doing fantastic work to fill in some crucial capacity gaps and rescue people who need rescuing. Ultimately, though, a sustainable search and rescue system depends on the actions of states. That's how it is.
Hi. Caroline, I'd like to hear a little more about discussions that you've been potentially having with the European Union on the role they're playing, the role they could be playing. What type of support or non-support are you getting?
This is unfair. So it's, first of all, it's not all European states with which we're in contact. I mean, it has reduced to Spain, France, Italy. Greece was contacted in the past month, but didn't pick up the phone. So it's really like a very small number of states involved. Now that we have an association in Switzerland, we're also trying to engage the discussion on this. And what that's what I said earlier. Basically, the discussion are mainly on establishing a predictable system of disembarkation and, if possible, in the nearest place of safety, which de facto puts Malta, Italy, and then France and then Spain on the to-call list on board the Aquarius. Malta has, I would say, a position that is interesting because they've been involved. Some NGOs boats have been stopped when they docked in La Valette. At least with the Aquarius, the relationship has been more or less okay in the past month. What they're calling for, rightly, is for a system of dispatch of the people who would land in Malta. Italy, as you all know, has a new interior ministry, quite lively, very active on social networks, and has officially launched, it's an hashtag battle. So he said, close ports, open arms, which we still haven't looked at the open arms or hearts, open hearts side. But the closed port, officially, it's not, we could try to go back to Catania. The point is that it would be a bit difficult not to be stopped in Catania because we had the case with other boats before where they stopped on accusations from a prosecutor, and it started last year already, so it would be a bit foolish to basically go and jump in the open arms, open hearts country. At the same time, he rightly pointed the fact that Italy cannot handle the situation alone and that there has to be a system of redistribution of people all over Europe. The problem is the way he did it, basically taking people hostage on board the Aquarius in June. And then France has had also a very schizophrenic position, I would say, with massive support, civil support and cities support, even Corsica support for the Aquarius and for what the Aquarius stands for somehow. And then Macron has had a position a bit weird, even claiming at some point that NGOs were playing smugglers' game, which is not easy to hear. And then Spain, with the new government, has, just also to put back into context, at the moment, Spain is hosting more people since the beginning of 2018. It's not Italy at all. So they've played the game quite well. We were extremely grateful that they welcomed us in June in Valencia. Now we don't have, again, it's a question of predictability. We don't know whether, in case we don't find another place of safety, if we can do that in Spain. It's not for sure. Nothing is for sure, and that's exactly the tricky part. And that's the new cards we have in hand. No, it's always a bit like no, but it's a complex matter.
Oh, you look like an international organization. There's
the
bad
smile.
influence
It's
on
the
you.
Smile. No, but it's basically the answer we are getting. I mean, it's a complex matter. Yes, of course, we understand the difficulties and the necessity and the moral obligation to save people's lives, but at the same time, you have to understand it's a very difficult political context at the moment with the rise of populism. We can.
Many thanks for your presentation. In particular, Dorota, I would have a question of clarification for you. We are not experts in this question of law at sea at the ICRC, so it's always interesting to hear from experts on these questions. So if I understood correctly, there's no obligation as such for states to open their ports for disembarkation, but there's an obligation to cooperate between states and identify a port for disembarkation. But what happens if they either don't cooperate or they cooperate but don't come to a solution on a port of disembarkation? So that would be my first question. And the second one is more general on an enforcement mechanism under the law at sea. Yeah. Does such mechanism exist?
The IMO conventions do not have this term of open, you have the obligation to open your ports. As I said, there is an obligation to designate a place of disembarkation, whether it is a port or whether it is any other place, whether it is another ship. It's a question of interpretation of treaties. So you won't find in IMO conventions the obligation to open ports. To answer your second question, there is IMO as an international organization doesn't have enforcement power, but there is a very well established and very well functioning enforcement of IMO treaties, which is done through flag states, port states, and coastal states. So these are the three pillars of the enforcement of IMO treaties. And the important thing to understand is that the underlying principle of all IMO treaties is so-called no more favorable treatment principle, which means that if a ship is flying a flag of a non-state party to a treaty, and if it goes to a port of a state party, it has to comply with those treaties. And this is why IMO treaties are so powerful that they cover 99% of merchant ships operating in the world. And we are talking about 40,000-50,000 of treaties, of ships merchant ships operating on a daily basis around the globe. So yes, there is a very, very effective enforcement mechanism of IMO treaties. Whenever a ship is calling a port, this ship can be inspected, controlled, surveyed for various requirements in terms of compliance with all treaties which are in force in this particular state.
But I guess your question was also what if a state, because here you refer to the obligation of the ship, but what if a state doesn't respect its obligation under the law of the sea? Is there an enforcement mechanism?
The enforcement mechanism between states, if states do not comply, is between states. The IMO is not looking from this perspective. Okay. IMO is looking from the perspective whether ships comply.
Yes. There was a discussion during the summer between Malta and Italy via Twitter on who was holding their responsibilities and who wasn't. Mm-hmm. So it's also one game that is being played at the moment on you pointing fingers on who's.
What's the role of ICRC? How can the ICRC can help or be active in this situation?
But I think we have multiple roles. First role, it's clearly we have promoted the Global Compact on Migration, Objective 8, and I think we have a key role in reminding states that their migration policy should be designed in a way that it doesn't increase the risk for migrants going missing at sea or elsewhere, because migrants are going missing because of migration policies in many contexts, in desert, I mean, in detention, and you name it. So I think here we have really a key role. I also think that it's a bit, we are an old institution, and somehow we claim some credit for creating a space for independent humanitarian assistance. And I think there are organizations which are not the ICRC and are delivering this humanitarian assistance, which are at the core of what is humanitarian assistance, basically saving life to people, irrespective of where they come from. And I think here again we have a role in this, and I think this forum is also the opportunity to do it. Yeah, I would say those are two important roles. And on search and rescue operation, properly speaking, I think it's a call we need to have two states along the Mediterranean Sea, but also in other contexts, because we know that similar problems do exist in the Andaman Sea, very far from our screen, in the Gulf of Aden, in the Gulf of Bengal, in desert, in many regions of the world where people just simply vanish and are not rescued.
This is a question specifically for Cameron. And previously you have indicated that the principle of non-refoulement actually applies in territorial waters. But my question is, does non-refoulement actually also applies to non-exclusive, exclusive economic zones and international waters? Suppose if a state party, like a ship representing a state party, exercises in refoulement in an international water, does that constitute to non-refoulement or a violation to the principle?
Yes. No, my answer is very simple. If a state exercises control over a person in international waters and then engages in conduct which returns them to a place which would constitute a violation of the principle of non-refoulement, that's the principles engaged in those circumstances, yeah.
So it also applies to exclusive economic zones?
I think for the purposes of this discussion, exclusive economic zones, insofar as they're outside the state to which you're talking about returning territorial waters, it's the same deal as international waters.
I would just like to thank again our panelists for this very contrasted and lively discussion, and maybe give you the last word, each of you, to tell us a bit if you had one or two key recommendations and what they would be in order to remove the current deadlock.
I don't have very clear practical suggestions for how to resolve the deadlock. For what resolving the deadlock should look like, ideally, no surprises. I'll come back to points that I've already made. The commitment to assisting anyone who needs assistance at sea needs to be rock solid and unwavering. And for that to happen, the disembarkation issue has to be solved. There has to be a predictable mechanism across the Mediterranean involving as many states as possible to ensure that anyone who's rescued gets disembarked in a place where they can access international protection if they need to. And just for 2 quick more seconds, also we need to look beyond search and rescue itself, although that remains at the core, and we need to look at ways of building asylum systems in all states that have signed onto those obligations so that people can access protection where they are if they need to and don't need to get on boats in the first place, and can have access to safer means of getting to that protection somewhere else in cases where that's appropriate and that's available, and so more opportunities for that as well. And I've sort of said that also to set up as a plug for the Global Compact on Refugees, because we've heard a few mentions for the Migration Compact, and the Global Compact on Refugees is also aimed at those bigger questions.
What I would like to mention, which I haven't mentioned before, is that the problem of mixed migration by sea is a standing agenda item of many IMO meetings. We had high-level meetings addressing this issue, and it will be discussed again later on in the year at IMO. We, of course, stand ready to provide any assistance and facilitate any coordination between our member states who would like to discuss the issue of whether search and rescue or disembarkation. It is discussed by the Maritime Safety Committee. We have a specific subcommittee, which is Navigation, Communication and Search and Rescue Subcommittee. So it is constantly on the agenda of IMO. We haven't forgotten about this, of course, and IMO will continue to play its role in this discussion and in facilitating the cooperation between our member states.
Mm-hmm. And quite legitimately, the last word to you.
No, it's just I hope I'll never be invited again as SOS Mediterranean, which would mean that there's an institutionalized system taken in charge by the European Union, and that NGOs are not needed anymore in the Central or in the Mediterranean Sea to save people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for this invitation.
Yeah, and knowing that, not wanting to be pessimistic, but knowing that this wish that definitely the ICRC share, and this call for a coordinated mechanism of search and rescue, in the same time, long life to the Aquarius. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.